Reality. Women work less hours than men. Women who work 40-hour weeks earn 88% of what men make. It's also nonsense, by the way, that women and men who work more than 40 hours per week work the same number of hours overall. Women who are married and have kids, it turns out, often take the time out to have their kids, which is what my wife did. She's in medical school. She took a year off to have our baby, which is why single women who have not married earn 96% of what men make. That other 4% gap, well, that includes the fact that men work riskier jobs and take on jobs with a higher risk of firing. Statistically, men actually prefer risk, while women prefer security when it comes to labor. Men also tend to spend their college years on non-liberal arts subjects in greater numbers than women, and they're more likely to ask the boss for a raise. In fact, the numbers are even better than that for women. Time magazine reported in 2010, quote, in 147 out of 150 of the biggest cities in the United States, the median full-time salaries of young women are 8% higher than those of the guys. Okay, now as for the notion that women are battling against a so-called war on reproductive rights. First off, nobody has the right to kill an unborn child. That's not a reproductive right. Second, contraception has never been cheaper or more widely available. Congratulations! Condoms cost 20 cents per pop. So let's say that you're really randy, and that means that you want to go at it 5 times a week. That's $1 a week, folks. That's $4 a month. You gonna go broke on $4 a month? Birth control pills cost no more than $50 a month. Requiring a nun to pay for your birth control is not, it turns out, a right. Actually, it's more like a violation of the nun's right to religious freedom. On to sexual assault. Public awareness of sexual assault and domestic abuse is obviously a worthwhile cause with which everyone agrees. It is worth noting, however, that there has never been a rapist in human history who decided not to rape, thanks to a public service announcement from Joe Biden. But the implication that sexual assault is on the rise, that's nonsense too. Reality. From 1995 to 2010, sexual assault victimizations declined 58% according to government statistics. Domestic violence fell 63% between 1994 and 2012. Serious intimate partner violence against women dropped 72% from 1994 to 2011.
I'm offended by the language of uprising applied to people who are breaking into other black people's stores and looting them. This is a lack of values. And people who are destroying private property, destroying cop cars, in an uprising against what exactly? Against the black police chief, against a mostly minority police force, against the black mayor, against the black president, against the black attorney general. The idea that we're supposed to correlate your level of outrage with a certain level of justification, in other words, the more outraged you are and the more angry you are, the more justified you must be, is absolute nonsense.
How can you argue that racism is not a driving factor in income inequality?
Because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. And when you have a culture that doesn't, you know what? Explain to me. You explain to me why black kids aren't graduating high school. Explain that one to me. Explain to me why black kids are shooting each other in rates significantly higher than whites are shooting each other. Explain to me why 13% of the population is responsible for 50% of the murder. Explain to me why the number of black kids in prison, not for innocent reasons, not for walking down the street and getting pulled into a prison, is so high. Explain, if it has nothing to do with culture, explain to me why the single motherhood rate in the black community jumped from 20% to 70% in the same course of time that the civil rights movement has made such tremendous strides. Is America more racist now than it was in 1960? And if it is, please explain to me how that happened.
And so we have to somehow try to influence the outcome, but as to it, to do it right now, I have no idea.
Yeah. Ben, what about you?
Well, I mean, I think that it's easy to do hindsight, and it's hard to do foresight, obviously. In hindsight, obviously, nobody should have pulled the troops out. It was idiotic. The number of troops, people don't know this, how many ISIS fighters actually went into Iraq originally? Anybody know the answer to this? How many ISIS fighters originally crossed the border from Syria into Iraq? 5,000. It's 5,000 people, right, against an army of 121,000 in Iraq. And they proceeded to take over half the country. And that's because the army in Iraq was incredibly weak, right? And because, as always, the left in the United States believes idiotically that if people are really, really into fighting for their country, they'll just do it. They said this about the South Vietnamese. When we pull out, they'll fight for themselves and it'll be fine, right? They said this over. They said this, by the way, in 1918 when the Reds took over. There was the White Russians versus the Red Russians, and we actually had troops in Russia. And Britain sent troops to Russia also. This idea that the communists and the Americans never fought is not true historically. Right after World War I, there were actual U.S. troops who were killed in Russia. And we pulled out because Woodrow Wilson said, well, if the Red Russians want it, they'll take it. And if the White Russians want it, they'll take it. And so the same thing sort of held true there. We pulled out, and Obama said, let God sort them out, basically. They'll figure it out. Vladimir Putin is not crazy.
He's certainly not stupid. Vladimir Putin is a power politician down to his bones, and he is the most successful Russian leader since Stalin. What he is doing right now is unbelievably audacious, and he knows he's got a sucker in the White House, and he's going to continue pushing until there's no pushback. Or until there is pushback, rather. And what he's done, you have to see what Putin's doing as part of a chain, right? So first he starts off and he tries to push Bush by invading Georgia. And so he takes over part of Georgia at the very end of Bush's tenure, and Bush pushes back a little bit, but not enough, and he ends up maintaining part of Georgia as now Russian territory. Then Obama comes into office, and Obama, after Bush was already weak on Russia, after Bush was already too weak on Russia, he comes into office, he says, we're going to reset. Sorry, he was too strong. We need to reset now. And so Putin looks around and says, okay, well, I'm not going to leave Medvedev in charge, right? I mean, now I've got my man. I'm coming back. And so he came back, and then he proceeded to invade Ukraine under the same guys that Hitler used to invade Czechoslovakia. Right? He invades Crimea, which is part of Ukraine. And he does so under the guise that Crimea has a bunch of ethnic Russians who are being set upon by the locals, right? Which is exactly what Hitler said about Czechoslovakia. And so he has to invade there. And Obama does nothing as the entire country is overrun, and as Russia starts shipping in Russian forces to Ukraine proper. By the way, Russia, I mean, understand, Vladimir Putin has shot down not one, but 2 civilian airliners while he's been while he's been the current president of Russia, and the West has done nothing. Right? He shot down that Malaysian flight recently, and then before that, he shot down the flight that had like half the Polish government on it, because he didn't like the Polish government, so he just shot it down. Right? And nobody did anything. And so now he looks in the Middle East, and he says, okay, Obama clearly wants out of here. And Obama made that clear when he drew his red line in Syria, and then he proceeded to hand over that entire deal to Putin. Putin came in last minute and said, oh, Barack, I can handle this. And Obama said, sure, sounds great, all yours. And Putin walked right in the front door. So what's going to happen next? Well, it's too little too late to start establishing no-fly zones.
Treating him like he's some sort of J.D. Salinger-esque recluse, and you can't find him anywhere. He's so difficult to find. We just have to keep the cameras on him at all times, lest Donald Trump escape from our eyes. I mean, you have a guy who's blowing on a ram's horn. It's not even Jewish holiday or something. He's blowing on a ram's horn and singing odes to Trump outside the Ryan meeting, right? And the media are covering this like it's news. I mean, it's unreal.
Out of 1,800 billionaires in the world, 12 of them are black. Where you come from, where you grow up, how much your parents earn, whether your parents were married plays a major role in determining where your
is there a question mark at the end?
Fact number 3, I would just like to remind you that hate speech is not free speech.
Yes, it is.
And my question is, since facts don't care about your feelings, why did you use false facts?
Okay, so none of the facts that I used are false. First of all, yes. No, okay, first of all, would you like the answer? Okay, so the 3 facts you mentioned, you talked about transgenderism. First of all, until 5 minutes ago, the DSM specifically defined transgenderism as a disorder. It defined it as gender identity disorder, now calls it gender dysmorphia, which doesn't even make sense. It says that depression is the actual problem, not the actual gender disorder, which again does not explain why the transgender suicide rate is upward of 40%, and the actual suicide rate for the rest of the American population is lower than 3%. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, you talked about income inequality, and you suggested that all wealth is inherited. This is nonsense. According to the IRS statistics, if you are born into the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States, you will not be one of the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States. 90% of people will not be within 15 years. There's tremendous wage mobility in the United States of America. Plus, there is not a group of people who just sit at the very top and stay there. People move up and down, in and out of the 1%. 1% just defines the line of income. It doesn't define the people who are in that 1% of income. I've been in the 1%. I've been out of the 1%. It will happen to lots of people. People who are older tend to be more likely to be in the 1%. They weren't once in the 1%. What happened? Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3, you say hate speech is not free speech. It depends how you define hate speech. The only speech that is not free speech is speech that overtly defends or pushes violence. Specifically, speech that is generating violence, right? That's the only type of speech that's not hate speech. If I say things you don't like, that's not hate speech. And if you think that it is hate speech, you're a fascist. End of story.